Hey everybody, I'm Ian, this is Mission Movement, and we've been talking to you about wrist mobility and wrist pain in CrossFit and weightlifting. A common question that I get asked is if someone should use wrist wraps or tape on their wrist, and when is it appropriate to do so. So we're just going to briefly talk about that today. Essentially, I don't necessarily recommend wrist wraps 100% of the time. They're definitely a good tool to use, but they're not mandatory for anybody most of the time. There are a few circumstances where they're important, I think. One being like very heavy max effort lifts going overhead or like pressing forward or bench press. Sometimes you might use them in events that required like handstand push-ups and stuff like that. But most of the time, those types of movements can be done without them. And frankly, if you can't do those movements without a wrist wrap, you probably have either an injury or a mobility restriction that you might want to have addressed, or you probably should have addressed. Now, I just briefly spoke about an injury, and that's the other circumstance where I do recommend using wrist wraps. So a common thing that I've seen, and I've actually seen it a few times very recently, is someone's pulling from the floor, they're doing a clean, they catch, but they don't have their fast elbows, they get under the bar, but not as far into the bar as they should have, and the bar crashes down on their wrist. Sometimes their elbow even crushes into their knee, and then they jam their wrist. And that can cause spraying of the little carpal ligaments between the little carpal bones. Can actually tweak some of the soft tissue in the wrist, can sprain the actual wrist joint, among other things. Ultimately, it leads to swelling and pain, and that's where a wrist wrap might be beneficial to help you continue training in those pushes after the fact. So, real quick, application of a wrist wrap or tape is very important to make sure that it's doing what you want it to do, okay? So one of the keys is making sure that it actually covers the tissue that you're looking for it to cover. So real quick, take your wrist and start sort of pushing around with your thumb and index finger, and you're gonna find two bones. One is right there on the pinky side, it's a little lower, and the other one is a little bit more distal, a little bit higher up on the thumb side, and you wanna just go just past those and you fall into these little squishy gaps. That's the actual wrist joint. That's where the radius and the ulna, the forearm bones, stop and the carpal bones begin. And we want to make sure that we're crossing that joint with either the tape or the wrist wrap. And it looks something like this. So we have wrist wraps here, compliments of CrossFit Mongoose. I'm going to make sure I start above that joint. So here's the joint. Cover the joint. And with this type of wrist wrap, as opposed to the Velcro wrist wrap, it's okay if it's not super tight right out of the gate. You can tighten it later. So I'm just going to make sure it's covered. Take the string, wrap it around, and then cinch it down. Now that cinching made it a little bit tighter, but if I want it to be tighter still, I'm actually just going to take it and I'm just going to keep rotating, and this kind of just cinches it down a little bit further and rotates it deeper, and then I'm just going to lock it tight with that. Now notice it's crossing the wrist. It is preventing me from full extension, preventing me from full flexion, but it's not so tight that it's cutting off circulation or causing me pain. This will help support if I got a barbell and I'm pressing overhead or pressing forward like a bench press. It can help stabilize the wrist and stuff like handstand push-ups or regular push-ups again. And again, if you've hurt yourself, this is not a bad idea, at least during the rehab period or the healing period. So if you like what we're talking about, make sure you go to the link in our bio and check out the blog post that we wrote about wrist mobility in CrossFit and how to prevent wrist pain. Also, make sure you like and follow us on Instagram. Thank you.